Okay, so thanks to Karthik and Anushya for the introduction and for the invitation. I recently came to know about Neurotech through Karthik, who gave me an excellent overview of the goals and activities of the organization. It looks like an exciting platform to me, and I'm grateful for the chance to speak to the community. Hope it will spark some interesting discussions. As Hanushya said, I am Seema and I've just finished my PhD from University of Hyderabad. I will be defending my thesis in a few days, so technically I am not a doctor yet, which is why I have written almost beside my name. It's funny because I've spent 5 years doing a PhD, but the weight of these final few months before I can officially call myself a doctor just feels endless. So I have decided to call myself almost doctor till I get that final certificate. Um, okay, so this figure is a pretty accurate depiction of most of our lives. At any given moment, there are 100 different things that are competing for our attention. You are trying to listen to me right now and pay attention to what is on the screen, but your phone might be blinking and you might be itching to check if there is a new WhatsApp message or a Twitter notification. Or maybe your neighbors are screaming and you can't help getting distracted by these noises. All of these are different sources of attention capture. And at every moment of our lives, each one of us is executing attentional control. That is, we are constantly deciding what do we pay attention. This kind of control over attention is crucial for almost everything that we do. So today's talk is going to be about how some of these things are studied in a cognitive psychology lab with a specific focus on how we attend to things that we are not even consciously aware of. Since not all of you are from cognitive science or psychology background, I will start first by talking about what is cognitive science and give a basic idea of how attention is studied in the lab. I will then end with discussing some of my own research on attention. So in the 1950s, a bunch of people, mostly linguists, computer scientists, and psychologists, came together for a series of conferences in the US where they started talking about how we need a new kind of science to study the mind. Psychology at that point in time was mostly concerned with the outer behavior of humans and not much concerned with what goes on inside the mind. So, as a result of some dissatisfaction with the way things were, coupled with advances in computer science, a new approach to the study of mind and brain was devised, which came to be known as cognitive science. The figure that you're seeing is one of the most famous figures, symbolic of the field. And if you've taken an intro to cognitive science, you've probably seen it. The figure is important because it signifies the primary tenet of this discipline, that it would be interdisciplinary. The idea back then was that it's not possible to truly understand how the mind works without contributions from these various disciplines, such as philosophy, neuroscience, anthropology, linguistics, and so on. So, the way most cognitive scientists study the mind is by dividing it into subsystems. This division is mostly functional in nature. Now, just to be clear, the division into these various systems does not imply complete independence among them. That is certainly not the case. So, a little bit of memory is involved in attention, for example, and attention is involved in emotion processing. So, there are definite interconnections. It is just that this division helps in systematically studying various cognitive functions. Today's focus obviously is on one such subsystem, which is attention. So, how do we scientifically define attention? No talk on attention is complete without invoking this quote from William James, who was an American philosopher and psychologist. He established the first psychology department in the US in Harvard and is considered to be one of the founding fathers of modern experimental psychology. He wrote a two-volume book called Principles of Psychology, which sort of set the tone for the next 100 years of research on experimental psychology. This quote is from the book where he famously said, "Everybody knows what attention is." A running joke in the field is that although James said this, in reality, nobody knows what attention is, and we use this quote to get away from properly defining it. Um, so, even though it has been notoriously hard to define attention, there are some attributes that can be used to understand it. One is the notion of capacity limitation. As the James quote says, at any moment we are getting bombarded by an enormous amount of information. So right now there are several objects in your visual field: your table, your laptop, a bed, pillows, closet, books, and curtain, wall, and 100 other things. You're getting perceptual input from all this. And this is just with vision. There are all the there are all the things that you are hearing and smelling and touching as well. It is impossible for our brains to process all of these inputs because there is an inherent limitation in our processing capacity because of the way our brains are built. Which is why we need a selection mechanism that filters out some things for further processing and leaves out a lot of other things. Now, what is selected and what is ignored depends on several factors, and I won't get into that. But the key point here is that this mechanism of selection is broadly defined as attention. Attention can be classified into different categories based on the kind of information over which the selection is happening. So, when you're sitting in front of a computer and reading the text on the screen, you're attending to external information in the world. So attention here refers to the selection and modulation of the sensory information that is generated from physical objects in the real world. In contrast, if you're sitting in front of a computer, but you've zoned out and thinking about your last hiking trip, you are paying attention to internal information and not to something that physically exists out in the world. So here, attention refers to selection of information mostly stored in your long-term or short-term memory. It is important to note that there are capacity limitations even with internal attention. There's only so much you can think about in a given moment, and internal attention helps us select those thoughts and representations. Let us now focus more on external attention. Further classification is made based on the type of external information that is being attended to. One form is where you attend to different features such as color or shape or orientation of an object. For example, the red color of the apple here. We now know that there are distinct brain areas involved in processing of distinct features. So feature-based attention is where information is selected on the basis of features. For example, when you're searching for your red colored car in a crowded parking lot, you're trying to filter out the vast amount of visual information in front of you based on this particular feature, which is the color red. The other important form is spatial attention, where you focus on locations in your environment. It is often compared to a spotlight, where a stream of light illuminates whatever is in its path. A good metaphor is to think of it as shining a torch in a dark room. You only see objects at the locations where the torch is being pointed at. We use spatial attention all the time in our daily lives. It is different from feature-based attention because selection is happening purely based on locations, irrespective of what object is there in those locations. For example, when you look left or right while crossing the road, you're scanning different locations on the road and not looking for a particular feature or an object. Most of my work has been on understanding spatial attention. So for the rest of the talk, that is what I will be focusing on. Okay, so how do we study spatial attention in the lab? Typically, a participant sits in front of a screen and is administered an experiment that looks something like this. They see two empty boxes at first, followed by the brightening of one of the boxes. In attention land, this is called a cue. What this cue does is that it summons attention to wherever it is located. Think of it again as shining a torchlight to this box. Next, a target is presented in one of the boxes. In this case, the target is a small black disk that appears inside one of the boxes, and the task is to press space the moment you see it. Now, the box can appear either at the same location as the cue, as shown here, or it can appear at the opposite location. So what we typically measure in such studies is the reaction time, or RT. That is, how much time do you take to press the space key after you have seen the target. This time is a reflection of all the internal cognitive processing that has happened while you were seeing all this on the screen. The main idea here is that because your attention is already near the cue, you would be faster in responding if the target also appears at the same location. Instead, if the target comes somewhere else, then you have to remove your attention from the cue and go somewhere else. This takes time and shows up in the time you take to respond to the target. So the common result is that the reaction times are fast trials as opposed to when they don't. This is a paradigm that is used to study spatial attention in the most basic version. As you will see in the next part of my talk, this can be modified and extended to investigate a variety of questions like how do we decide what to attend to, or how do we decide what to ignore, and at this point, some of you might be thinking in what way the findings from such a simple task with squares and dots inform us about attention in the real world. Because obviously, the kind of situations we encounter, like searching for a car or avoiding traffic, are all so much more complex than finding a small black disk on a computer screen. That is a completely legitimate question. And the premise of doing such studies is that studying cognitive mechanisms in the real world is extremely complicated because human beings are extremely complicated. Now, the time you take to find your car in a parking lot does not depend only on your attentional abilities. It also depends on what mood you are in, or whether there is someone around to help you or distract you, whether you're in a rush to go somewhere, and etc. etc. So it is impossible to isolate attention or any specific cognitive function in real world behavior. So we create this overly simplistic experimental setup where we are in full control of the variables and see how people perform. And the assumption is that these findings would generalize to more complex, uncontrolled situations as well. That is the assumption based on which experimental psychologists have operated for many decades now. The validity of this assumption is up for debate, and I personally have started to question, question it a little bit recently. I won't comment more on this now, but if people are interested, we can discuss this later. So the final classification relevant for this talk is between conscious and unconscious attention. So right now you see an X on the screen and you are consciously paying attention to it. I can know if you're conscious of it by asking you, did you see X? And if your answer is yes, then I can be sure that you've seen it. So this is a form of conscious attention. But it is also possible to attend to objects that you're not consciously aware of. For example, just now, it is like that some of you missed the letter that was presented on the screen. That is because it was presented for a very, very short duration and was followed by what we call a mask, which is meant to suppress the after image of that letter. So even if you're looking at the screen, you might have missed the letter. This is one of the methods that is typically used to induce lack of awareness in an experimental setup in a lab. Of course, it's a lot more effective when we actually do it in the lab, and this was just a demo. But the key idea is that we present something for a very, very brief duration. And if we ask people, did you see it? The answer will most likely be no. But through our experiments, we see that whatever was presented on the screen has still influenced the person's responses. So that is how we conclude that the person has unconsciously processed the information that was presented to them. So I will end the first part of my talk by discussing the link between attention and eye movements. More often than not, if we want to attend to something, we need to look at it. Because of that, eye movements are a naturally good response system to measure attention. And second, eye movements are fast. It takes an average of 200 milliseconds to initiate an eye movement. In contrast, it takes an average of at least 5 to 600 milliseconds for you to press a key on the keyboard. While this difference may not seem like a lot in the real world, at the time scale in which we are measuring these effects, 3 to 400 milliseconds is a lot. This is more so because some of the attentional effects we measure in the lab are very fast and they're short. So the effect can get lost by the time it takes for someone to press a key. So eye movements are good at tapping into even the fastest of mechanisms. Also, eye movements give us several parameters that can be analyzed to derive a more comprehensive picture of the data. We can obviously measure where people are looking, but we can also know other parameters like how fast the eye movement was generated, which is called the saccade latency, or what was the trajectory of the eye movement, in which direction did it start, and what was the curvature, and so on. These saccade parameters are a richer source of information than mere button presses. Some people also use pupil measures such as dilation, which are said to be indicative of cognitive processes as well. Um, so with this background, I will now start discussing some experiments that demonstrate unconscious attention and factors that modulate it. This was a study published a few years ago by some researchers at NUS, Singapore, I think. Their interest was in showing that unconscious information can influence where we look. To test this, they asked participants to freely look at one of these four locations. They could choose completely on their own where they wanted to look. Before this stage, they presented a cue at one of the locations for a very short duration, which was 33 milliseconds here. Because the duration was short and the display was followed by a crowded display like shown here, the cue could not be consciously perceived. So if you ask the participants in the study if they saw this single cue appear anywhere on the screen, they would have said no. The question was, would people look more often at the location of the cue, even though they did not see it, and even though they were supposed to be choosing where to look freely and voluntarily? The answer is yes. People did look more often at the cued location. They were also faster in making the eye movement in these cases. It is important to note that this bias is very small. As you can see in this figure, people are looking at the cue location approximately 30% of the times. If there was no cue, we would have expected people to look at each location roughly 25% of the times, which is chance level. So the effect seen here is a little more than chance. So it's not that people will always look at the location of the unconscious cue, which makes sense because unconscious influences are not that strong. They only create a small bias towards certain responses. So there have been several other studies that have similarly shown that unconscious information can capture our attention. That is pretty well known and well accepted now. My interest during my PhD was to ask a slightly different question, which is it possible to ignore unconscious information that is not relevant to us? This question is important because several models have assumed that we process unconscious information fairly automatically. So it might not be possible to strategically ignore unconscious information because how do you ignore something if you can't see it? So to test this, we administered a similar eye movement task as we saw earlier. There was a central colored circle surrounded by four black circles. A cue was presented for 16 milliseconds at one of the locations. And after a variable duration, the participants were asked to look at one of the black circles. In this case, the two circles on top are relevant because the instruction was that if the central color circle is blue, you have to look at one of the upper circles. The upper locations are relevant in this case, and the two circles at the bottom are irrelevant because the participant has been explicitly told not to look at those locations on that trial. Now, we have seen from the earlier study that unconscious cues capture attention, and we expected the same thing here. But the question here was, do they still capture attention if they appear at locations that I know are irrelevant to me? In other words, is it possible to strategically modulate to what extent unconscious information affects our processing, depending on how relevant they are to our goals? To answer this, we measured different eye movement metrics. First level of analysis was to check if the unconscious cues were having any effect at all, as established in earlier studies. We found that expected pattern here. If there was no cue, the probability that people would look at one of the locations is 50%. So there are two possible locations. We found that people looked a little more often than chance at the cued locations, as seen by the pink bar here. This showed that our experiment was successful in capturing the unconscious effects. Next was to test our critical hypothesis regarding the cues at irrelevant locations. To do this, we measured the time taken by people to initiate an eye movement towards one of the circles. Just like reaction times with button press, the Saccard reaction times or latency tell us about the underlying processing that has resulted in that eye movement. So the Saccard latency data showed that cues at irrelevant locations did not slow people down much, which means that they were ignored to some extent. Because if they had not been ignored, they would have interfered with the task and slowed down the eye movements, which we did not see. We conducted another experiment with a slight variation and confirmed that this pattern replicates. So to summarize, we found that it is possible to ignore irrelevant unconscious information to some extent, if not completely. This challenges some traditional assumptions regarding the automaticity of unconscious processing and suggests that even unconscious attention is under the control of the individual's overall goal. Okay, so I will end with a final study where we studied unconscious processing in hearing impaired individuals. It is well known that loss of hearing in the deaf leads to enhanced visual processing. The mechanism through which this happens is neuroplasticity. So it is a compensatory mechanism by which loss of input in one modality, that is audition, leads to increased processing of input in another modality, for example, vision. Studies have shown that in the deaf brain, areas that are typically involved in processing auditory information now take over the processing of visual information. Of course, vision is not the only sense that receives a boost in the deaf. There are studies that have showed increased processing of tactile information, for example. But since we are talking of visual attention here, I will focus on the visual processing advantage. Many studies have shown that these so-called visual advantages in the deaf are there in the conscious domain. Our interest was to see if the deaf are also better at processing unconscious information. Okay, so the experiment started with a number, either 1 or 2, being presented on the screen for a very short duration, so 33 milliseconds. Next, the pattern was shown to make this number unconscious. Because the number was shown for a very short duration and was quickly followed by this pattern, the participants could not really report what number was shown on the screen. Next, the main target was shown. So if the number was 1, the participants had to press A on the keyboard. If the number was 2, they had to press L. These were called forced choice trials because there was a fixed rule for uh, which key had to be pressed. However, if the number was 0, they were asked to freely choose to press either A or L. It was completely up to them which key they decide to press. These were called free choice trials because the participants can freely decide what to press, at least as free as one can be in such experimental setups. The idea here was that if the unconscious number is 1 and the main target is also 1, participants are faster in pressing A because the unconscious number has already triggered that response. By that I mean the brain has sent motor signals to press A, which matches with the actual response required on that trial. But let's say the unconscious number is 1, but the target is 2, then the responses are slower. This is because the unconscious 1 triggers the response A, but the main target 2 triggers the response L. So this conflict has to be sorted out before finally pressing a button. This slows things down and results in slower reaction times. Because of this, people are more likely to choose to press A, even though they are supposed to be making this choice freely. Similarly, if the number is 2, people are more likely to press L. Coming to the results, both groups of participants chose the response associated with the unconscious number more often than chance. This was an expected effect and has been shown many times before. What was novel was that the extent to which the unconscious numbers influenced responses was much higher in the deaf. A similar pattern was observed even for the reaction time data. Participants were much faster when they gave responses associated with the unconscious number. Again, this effect was much greater in the deaf. Again, we did another experiment with a slight variation and found the same results. Taken together, these experiments show that unconscious processing of the kind that was measured in these experiments is greater in hearing impaired individuals. We have shown that visual advantages found so far are not restricted to the visible domain. The deaf show greater sensitivity even to briefly presented information. Um, what this also tells us is that there are individual differences in the way people process unconscious information. Just like not all of us process conscious information in the same manner and to the same depth, it's possible that we all don't process unconscious information similarly. Unfortunately, there is not a lot of research on this among non-clinical population, but evidences like this study, point towards such a difference. Okay, so to conclude, the studies that I have discussed show that one, it is possible to attend to information that we are not consciously aware of. And two, this is not an automatic process. The extent to which we process unconscious information varies as a function of several factors. I have discussed a few of them, but obviously there are many more, and the research is still on this. With that, I end my talk. I just want to talk a little bit about an initiative that my colleagues and I at University of Hyderabad have been involved in. It is called COP Talk, where we invite eminent researchers across a wide range of disciplines to speak about their work. The motive behind this talk series was to expose people to cognitive science defined started. It was meant to be an interdisciplinary enterprise. But unfortunately, that has not really happened. And a lot of people work within their disciplinary boundaries, not being aware of what is going on in other relevant fields. And that is is something that a lot of people are beginning to think that it needs to change. So in Cog Talk, we invite philosophers, cognitive anthropologists, linguists, psychologists, neuroscientists, and virtually anybody who has something interesting to say about the mind. Considering what I know about neurotech and its aims, I think a lot of you might find this interesting as well. So please check it out. The website link is here on the screen. You can view recordings of previous talks there. You can also subscribe to our mailing list and you will get notifications about upcoming talks. I want to thank University of Hyderabad, where I've been doing my research for the last 5-6 years, and my PhD supervisor, Professor Ramesh Mishra, and my wonderful colleagues who are a lot more than just colleagues. A lot of them are here actually in this session. Thank you guys for turning up. And thank you all for patiently listening to me. Please check out my website for more details on my research and other activities. I will be happy to take any questions.
Great. I think thank you so much, Seema. I think that was a very interesting session, which has triggered a lot of questions in my mind. But yeah, now the stage is open to questions. If you have any questions, kindly switch on your video and audio, and you can ask your questions to Seema. So, maybe I'll get my first question. Since it's very curious. So I have like 2 to 3 questions, but I'll get my first question. So, did you also consider other variables since it was like sort of binary? There were a number of participants and the experiments that you did. Did you consider other variables like the age of the person and the state of mind he is in, and other kind of variables which has a chance of influencing the attention of the person?
So, like I said somewhere, we try our best to control various conditions when we bring people to the lab. But all of that control is in terms of what we present to them, right? We obviously cannot have any control over what state of mind a person is in. You can get some data, yes, but it's impossible to make sure that everybody who comes to the lab is in great mood. We hope so, but not necessarily. In terms of age, yes, we have usually when we do these experiments, there is certain age bracket that we take participants from. So all the data that I have shown, the participants have been 18 to 35 years. Because mostly our participants we recruit from wherever the universities that we are in, right? So University of Hyderabad will have people in that particular age range. So unless you want to study the developmental trajectory of some of these effects, so you want to study how young versus older people vary on these things, we try to keep this age range within like 18 to 35. We want to study old, so we have done other studies where we've studied older bilinguals, let's say. So there we take people like 50, 55 to 70. So it depends on your question and which population that you're targeting. Yeah, age is certainly critical and something that we can control. Other things, not so much. The assumption is that because we collect data from 30, 40 people and we do multiple experiments testing the same core idea, these minute differences in mood or somebody slept less or somebody thinking of something else at a particular point of time, all of this will sort of get homogenized because we have a large sample. That's one of the reasons why we have, I mean, ideally we should have larger samples like 100,000, but resources, it takes a lot of resources to collect that much data. But the assumption is that when you have these many people and these many data points, because each experiment lasts, let's say 30 to 40 minutes. So we have like 500, 600, 700 trials. So when you take in all of these data together and the graphs that I showed you was like an average number across all these hundreds of trials and 30, 40 participants, right? So the assumption is that these extra factors will get sort of averaged out. What I see is what I'm trying to measure with the cognitive function.
Got it, Seema. Yeah. So just one follow-up to that, and I'll let the other questions. There are some of the other questions. So the main reason why I asked this question is, so since in a general human condition, I'm very curious about attention, and when we are exposed to a lot of things, a lot of unconscious things and conscious things, the attention span, that is, I have personally experienced reduced attention span rather than compared to 3 years before and now. Since I'm not sure, very sure of the reason, but I asked this question whether is there any sort of feedback through which we can increase the attention span, or are there any studies that have conducted, including all the variables, and is there any sort of feedback things to increase that? That's what I think neuromarketing companies also do in order to capture the attention of the customers. So yeah, just your perspective on that.
How to increase this attention span? So I'm sure there are studies where you can train people, right? There are a lot of training studies in cognitive science where you can enhance, let's say, span, or you can enhance some other aspect of attention. So the way to do that is to, I mean, the way I would think to do that is to administer tasks like this and give feedback to people when they are doing better and when they're doing worse. So then they use that feedback to sort of self-correct and get better at it. And then reward people when they get better at it. And then increase the difficulty and make them challenge themselves. And then again reward them when they get better. So tasks, yeah.
But should the variables be increased in order to understand, in order to get exactly to that fact, since the sample size is sort of, since you mentioned it's around 24 initially and also 52 or something like that. So the variables, what kind of variables need to be increased to exactly get the feedback, the right feedback?
I didn't follow that. What kind of
the thing is, since you said these kind of experiments can be conducted for the feedback. So what I feel is the variables in terms of the state of mind, if it is sort of got from take an EEG test and sort of get the alpha levels, and that might be an inclusion, and other sort of variables which can really give some exact accurate values of considering a real-time scenario, a real human life scenario, getting multiple unconscious and conscious inputs. So maybe is that the right way? That's what I feel. Maybe what are your perspectives on that? Finally.
So when I meant feedback in tasks like this. And here, what we give as feedback is like how slow you were, or how fast you were, or how many mistakes you made, and so on. So you're right. In that kind of feedback will only, I guess, improve performance and tasks like this. And as I said in the beginning, that does it generalize to these real world situations? I don't know. I really don't know. But I know that some people also maybe give neurofeedback, like you said, about the EEG levels and so on. I know of some studies like that. Yeah.
I think there are a few questions in this section. I think the first question is from Vishnu Shankar. Could you unmute yourself, Vishnu, and ask your question?
Hello, ma'am. Generally, how many number of people averagely required for this type of experiments?
I'm sorry.
Average number of people for the average number of people is required for this experiment.
Right. So it depends on the kind of experiment and the number. So we have something called as trials, right? So when I showed you one sequence on the screen in most of my experiments, that's one trial. And we usually administer like 500, 600, 700 trials to each person, which is why it lasts like 30 to 40 minutes. So how many people you need also depends on how many trials your experiment has. But if I have to just give you like top of my head an average number, typically it's 40 to 50 in one experiment. And
let's say digital marketing.
Sorry?
Digital marketing, like neuromarketing, digital marketing. Yeah, we display ads in digital marketing, right? Display ads in social media feeds, right? For that type of how many people generally like the people scrolls the feeds, the display ad, the neuro marketing. Like for that purpose, generally how many people we need to make a research? Average people.
Yeah, so if you're asking me, how do you decide in any experiment how many people to take? Actually, that should depend on previous research in that field. You cannot like there's no general number because it depends what kind of effects you're looking for, right? So if it is an effect that is very subtle, which is not, we say it's not robust in the sense that it's not something that's prevalent. For example, unconscious effects are quite subtle. It's not very robust. So if you're looking at an effect that is not very kind of common or prevalent and very easily found, then maybe you will need more people. Or if you're looking at an effect that's very easily, like you do it on any 10 people, you will get it. There are some effects like that. Then maybe then you need lesser number of people. So this decision of, it's called sample size in any experiment, should ideally depend on previous experimental research in that particular domain, and see what is the number of people have taken before, number of participants people have taken before, and what was their justification for doing that. And you have to follow that logic. There cannot be like a universal number for different kinds of research. It has to be informed by prior research in that particular domain. If you're saying it's
Yeah.
marketing, like you look at studies in neuromarketing where where people have presented ads and measured stuff and things like that. Look at papers like that that have been published and see the number of participants that are used there and what justification that they're giving, and go by that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, just follow up to that, just making sure to include all the variables in the samples might be an important factor. So the next question is from Sai. I think he was asking about whether data from wearable eye trackers is much better than integrated ones, because it can be used even in real time, so real world, to study real world scenarios. And yeah, that was the gist of the question. So I think you would see.
Yeah, so the question of which one is better, again, depends on what kind of question you're asking and where you're going. The wearable or any of these mobile eye trackers are better in the sense that, like he says, it that we can do real world research. So there's research where people have studied how badminton players anticipate from where the shuttle is coming and so on. And this kind of research obviously can be done only by wearing those glasses, right? But the disadvantage, at least as of now, in terms of technology, is that a lot of these mobile eye trackers don't have a very high sampling rate. The sampling rate, I mean, how many data points is it collecting per second, right? So if the eye tracker that we have here in University of Hyderabad has a sampling rate of 2000 hertz, which means it's taking the photograph of the eye 2000 times in 1 second, which is extremely accurate. Like you cannot get more accuracy than that. So if you're studying effects, like I was talking in the beginning of my talk, where they're very fast or they're short-lived, then you need that kind of precision to capture those effects. But if you just want to know where people are looking at a very broad level, like this person looked left for these many seconds and then they look somewhere else. For this kind of information, a lower sampling rate eye tracker is enough. So even 60 hertz, 100 hertz is okay. So there are pros and cons for both. And like I said, it depends what is your question and what is the kind of experiment that you're doing.
I think next question is from Nayanika. I think you can unmute yourself, Nayanika, if possible, and you can discuss with her.
Hi. I had two questions. One was that did you study the effect of consecutive trials on the latency in target identification? Like, what I mean by that is, you said that you're taking uh, 30 to 40 trials per subject. So, did the subject start improving in target identification in spite the queue, or did they start doing poorly? Like, did they have false identifications, or did they were they faster uh, uh,
Okay.
rejecting the queue? Or
Okay. I don't think I analyzed the data, but it's a very common effect that is seen in experiments like this, where as the experiment progresses, people get better at it. It is like a basic practice effect, right? So, as I said, I haven't looked at the data, but if I had to guess, I would say yes, as you're saying, people would have probably gotten faster at looking at the target as the experiment progressed.
so, did this affect the experiment? Like, the whole point was that how much does the unconscious cue in an irrelevant spatial location affect the target identification? So, didn't this play a very big factor in your studies? Like if I just know, for what I mean is, if I know that it will be an irrelevant position, I'll start dodging it, or start avoiding it, or
Oh,
start,
okay. Right. So yeah,
which
probably
again
not.
is
Yeah,
sorry.
I understand what you're saying. So probably not, because if you remember in my experiment, the the locations that were irrelevant were not constant across the entire experiment, right? So if it was blue, then up was relevant, down was irrelevant. If it was green, then up was irrelevant and down was relevant. So, and the blue and green they were mixed. So sometimes people saw blue and then maybe green and then blue and so on and so forth. So there was no constancy in terms of which locations were irrelevant. So the participants couldn't just, like completely filter out certain locations because, hey, this is not important for me at all for the experiment. Uh, so in this experiment, that was the case. But I have done other experiments as well where this was kept constant. So for an entire experiment, certain locations are irrelevant constantly. And I do, of course, the effects are stronger there, like you're saying, because of the same reason that I know for sure for the next 30 minutes, I don't have to bother about these two locations. So that obviously makes the effect stronger, by which I mean it makes it easier for the participants to ignore those irrelevant locations or the cues that come at irrelevant locations. But in terms of whether it improves, whether this ability to reject improves as the experiment goes on, I haven't found that myself. I would have expected it to actually, and I have looked at this data in another experiment of mine, but I didn't find it. Yeah, I don't know. But
Okay. Uh,
yeah, yeah.
Another
Sorry.
follow-up question. Did you also notice that like, as you said that the subject was asked to focus at a certain location, right? Or certain walls or
Yeah.
so. Like, did you, like, was there any way of understanding or identifying if the subject started focusing on a larger set of balls or something? For example, you asked me to focus on two, but I know that the experiment might want me to do something like identify the relevant locations, so I start focusing on all four. Like, was that the case with some subjects, or were you able to identify that this can be definitely avoided, or such trials can be eliminated?
So when we analyze the data, we only take those trials where the first saccade, but the first eye movement and the response stage directly goes to wherever it is supposed to go. So if they have like scanned multiple locations and gone there, we reject those trials because we only consider those trials where the performance is optimal. In this case, it is those trials where that first eye movement goes directly to the target location. So that's how we can sort of control for
Okay.
it. That I wouldn't say focusing, but they're making that eye movement to that one particular location.
Okay. Also, could you again show me show the results, or give me the reference to the paper that has the results to the first experiment that you
Okay.
discussed?
Do you want me to show it here?
Yeah, if you can. Otherwise, you can give me the link on the chat.
Okay, I will give you the Google Scholar link to the paper.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we'll go to the next question from Santi. Santi, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah. So hi, Dr. Seema, or almost Dr. Seema. Yeah. So my question is on, what is the effect or the implication of these unconscious, effects of these irrelevant cues? I mean, is there any computational change in the computational model of attention, or a practical application of this? What does this imply? I mean, where can this be useful?
Uh, so I think being able to ignore irrelevant stuff is something that is important, like I said, for almost everything that we do. And I mean, everything, like you're reading a book and there is somebody doing something in your visual field and you have to ignore them and focus on what you're doing and so on and so forth. sometimes this sort of distractions are very obviously visible and they're conscious, and sometimes they may not be unconscious in the way that it's present at for 16 milliseconds. I know that rarely happens in real life, that something is in front of you for 16 milliseconds, but you might have processed it unconsciously and without realizing it. So it may not be the presentation that makes it unconscious, but you are still processing stuff around you that you shouldn't be, which are irrelevant to you. So the question is, can we ignore or filter out such processing and focus on what our goals are? So I would say it's relevant to most of our sort of daily activities that require attention. And I mean, if you want something that's really sort of applied, maybe it can be used to train people to develop a higher sort of goal-oriented attention. Because, like Karthik was saying, some people have lower attention span. Some people. So why do people have lower attention span? Because they get distracted by stuff that they shouldn't be focusing on, right? So I guess you could use paradigms like this to train people as well, if necessary.
Got it. Sure. And could you explain more on the internal attention? So you were talking about external attention. What are the gist of things that goes on in internal attention? What do they study?
Okay, so I'm not an expert on that. I recently gotten interested, but what I know is that most of, like I said, most of internal attention operates on stuff that's already there, right? It's not dependent on stuff that's outside. But the biggest problem, I would say, with studying internal attention is that uh, like you can't present stuff on the screen and measure the way we do, right? The only way to do that is to ask people what they're attending to or what they've been ignoring. And historically, it has been known that it's not always reliable. That if I ask you, are you thinking about that? You might start thinking about that just because I've asked you, or you might lie. So internal attention is not as sort of, I would say, well studied and well developed as some of the things that I have talked about, primarily because of some of these methodological challenges. But I
Okay.
think, I personally think that it's probably as important as external attention, and maybe it even guides external attention. But that's just like my hypothesis, and I don't think there's a lot of research on it. Some people have written about it, but
Yeah. So there is not much studies that can be done to validate this. So there is not much of development that area.
yeah. I mean, there are some studies, of course. I'm not saying there's nothing, but it's not as because most of cognitive psychology is about like externally observable, verifiable phenomenon, right? It does not depend on asking people what is happening inside them. We are trying to infer based on the responses. So any field that involves, or any topic that involves these kinds of introspective or subjective reports is, it's a bit tricky. So yeah, but I think it should
Got
be studied. Yeah,
it. Sure. Sure. Thank you.
thank you.
Oh, thank you, Sina. I think we can go to the next question. Sai, are you able to unmute yourself now? Or you want us to ask the question? Yeah, okay. Then I think he's able to unmute this. So his question is again, follow up to Nainika's question. How do you decide noise in your eye movement? And aren't eye movements in the unconscious different between different locations or cultures or traditions? So this is
Yeah. So how do we decide what is noise? A lot of the work is done. I mean, depends again what software you're using to analyze the data and stuff. At least in my experiments, the system that we use, when you extract the data itself, there are certain criteria based on which a fixation is defined or a saccade is defined. So anything that does not meet that criteria is automatically filtered out. And we have, so it's just like reaction times, we have certain like outlier methods, right? That if something is very, very fast, like less than 80 milliseconds, then it's not, So, okay, what do we mean by noise? Noise is anything that kind of data that is not reflective of the cognitive mechanism that I'm trying to study, right? Anything else would be counted as noise. So there are certain criteria that most people use in the field, like less than 80 milliseconds. It cannot possibly be due to what I'm presenting on the screen. It's anticipatory. Or if it's extremely slow, then it probably means that person's attention has wandered off and they're not really doing the task the way I want them to do. So then those trials are discarded. So there are fairly set criteria that we use to basically figure out what are the eye movements that are a result of the manipulations that I have made in the experiment. And then we use that data. Okay, in terms of whether they differ between cultures, traditions, I think so, yes, for sure. And I have, this is something that has bothered me to some extent, but I haven't done anything about it. But I do agree that this assumption that attention or eye movements or any cognitive function for that matter is invariant across different cultures, which is the assumption, which is why people expect findings from Canada to replicate in India or China or Australia and so on. People have that assumption because the idea is that basic cognitive functions like attention or memory or perception should be, these are like Newton's laws, right? Like it doesn't matter what object you're studying or which country you're studying it in. Those are universal. It's supposed to hold across different regions or whatever. So that has been the assumption even in cognitive psychology, that some of these basic functions are universal, that it shouldn't differ across cultures. But like I said, I think that view is changing, and I personally believe that there is no reason to assume that these are invariant. Maybe some of them are, maybe some of them are not, and the only way we will know is by actually testing it. So there are a lot of studies now where that studies are replicated. Like if you do the exact same study in Canada, let's say, or in Japan, somewhere else, then will it hold? Will it not hold? And if it's not holding, then why? What is different in those people that's not giving rise to the same effect? Such studies are needed. They're happening, not at a very fast pace, but it's definitely happening. There has been a shift in the last few years, maybe a few decades, a decade at least. Yeah. So no, I wouldn't assume that these are invariant. If you ask my personal opinion.
So I'm just curious, since the state of the mind affects the attention level, is there any common definition in cognitive science or any science of the state of the mind? So what happens if I say, so is there any standard definition of what state of the mind is in terms of science or in terms of neurology?
I'm sorry, what state of the mind is
No,
what?
since you said if the mood is low or mood is high, it can affect the attention. So what do you define in science as mood? What is that? Is there any standard definition for that?
So, I mean, I don't know a lot about the mood literature, but I think there are positive and negative moods, right? And again, like I said, the only way to know that is to ask people. So I know that there have been studies where they check how mood affects like creativity or some tasks that measures creativity and so on. So these constructs like mood or some personality traits, stuff like that it's sort of borrowed from um, either social psychology or personality psychology or clinical psychology and so on. Because if you ask like experimental cognitive scientists, they wouldn't study stuff like mood. Because like I said, it's not something that I can independently measure. What mood you're in, I can know only by asking you, right? I can't figure out what mood you're in through some task.
But isn't alpha or beta activity or taking an EEG or even ECOG can give a sort of a reflection of what mood we are in?
Yeah, but that's brain activity, right? I'm talking of non-neural data, like through behavioral data, it's impossible to figure out. Brain states, yes. you can make, if you have these correlations between, like, if this is the brain state you observe, then this is what must be happening, which also are sometimes controversial, but at least if you have these correlations, yes, you can measure it through brain states. But how does something like mood reflect in behavior?
But does cognitive scientists don't look at the brain or the neural level?
Yeah, they
Is
do,
it-
they do. Okay, so
Yeah.
I should have corrected. You can't measure it through behavioral, experimental, like psychological data. Yes.
Got it. Any other question? Yes, I think those are the questions. Maybe I'll get back to you. I have a lot of questions. Maybe I'll read your research paper. I've already gone through it, but I'll get into it deeper and get back to you regarding the questions. But I think, yeah, so those were the questions. I think we had a very good number of participants this time. So thank you so much to all the participants. Hope you enjoyed the session. I think, thank you so much, Seema, for conducting a great session. So thank you so much to all, and we'll hopefully update you on the upcoming discussion forums too. So I'd like to invite Kalidas to thank our guest speakers.
Yeah, Karthik, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Seema, for a wonderful presentation and I thank all participants for joining the session. And the NTX handle pages are links are put in chat. You can just refer, and if you are new to the community, just join the community by using the Google form over there. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you. So yes, as he mentioned, you can just join the NTX India community if you haven't joined. And hopefully, we're also planning, maybe we can have a separate discussion on what are the plans for NTX India, and to get majorly all your views. Maybe I'm also thinking of having a separate discussion so that we can have a very open discussion and maybe get into some confirmation decisions on what can be the next set of things. Yes, maybe we'll update you in the email or in other platforms. So kindly watch out. And thank you so much, Seema. Thank you so much.
So thanks to you for the invitation. It was an interesting experience, and thanks to all the participants and for the great questions. Thanks again.
Thank you. Yes. So hopefully, we'll see you in the upcoming weeks. All of
Yes.
you. Thank you.